Week 2 is in the books, Tyler, and we had a lot happen this week, man. This was a busy week for fantasy football, and if you are a fantasy manager with something happening on your team, whether it's injuries, a player getting benched, changes happening to your team, don't worry, you are not alone. Everybody is going through something, whether you're 2-0, 1-1, or 0-2. Chances are you've had something affect your roster because this week was an absolute shit show, Tyler. It was just a lot happening. We had a notable quarterback bench. We had a lot of injuries to teams that were already decimated with injuries, a lot of IR players, man. And I think the first thing we got to acknowledge, man, is that this is fantasy football. And if you had a take at the beginning of the year, it's time to move off the tank and just win your league, man. And injuries is a big part of this, navigating through it, especially with bye weeks coming up in the next 3 weeks, right? We have bye weeks start week 5. And there's a lot of injuries this week, man. Overall, I'm very concerned about just fantasy in general right now because we're going to be going to the waiver wire pretty heavily throughout the year. Overall, man, just a lot of injuries, a lot of players going on IR, a lot of star players. We had Cooper Kupp go on IR. We had Joe Mixon is banged up. Justin Jefferson got banged up in his game. We had Deebo Samuel and AJ Brown just coming out saying they're going to be out a couple weeks. Not to mention the week 1 injuries we already had. Isaiah Pacheco was on IR, man. Talk to me. How are you feeling about these injuries right now after week 2?
Yeah, I mean, injuries are always just a very unfortunate part of fantasy because, I mean, you draft guys and maybe they underperform, which is one thing, but to see guys get hurt is always just it's kind of infuriating for fantasy just because you can't. There's not much you can do. They're just the unfortunate part of the game. So I do think like this is a big week. I mean, you're talking there's a lot of like third, second round kind of guys that got hurt this week. That are, big name players that are staples of your lineups that will now be out multiple weeks. But I mean, the biggest thing is definitely Isaiah Pacheco, just because they've already came out and said this is going to be a 68-week long injury. And that's significant. I mean, that's a big chunk of the fantasy season. So, and you have like this one of the best offenses in the NFL. So now we have a situation where we're not quite sure who the guy is, who's going to step in. I think that there should be like Carson Steele, in my opinion, looks like the guy who's probably going to be the early down grinder with Samaje Perine playing third downs. But which one is going to be the key pickup during this time? And you also have Kareem Hunt, who's currently visiting with the team, could also be signed by this team as well. So for me personally, I'll just give my take real quick. Go ahead.
Yeah, with when it comes to injuries, though, like this, because we're going to have that dilemma with the Rams receivers, right? There's going to be other teams that we just have a ton of just injuries, and we're trying to debate, like that's that Chiefs scenario. We saw like there's going to be a lot of question marks when it comes to injuries. Strategy-wise, though, sometimes you got to think about this, right? Like a lot of times you think, this is happening to me. Every year this happens to me. My guys get hurt. And that's a common thing I hear. And it's like everybody has injuries, every single team. And you talked about it. That's just fantasy football. So take the poor me out of it. This is only happening to me, and just realize when you're coming up here, guys are going to have other buys. Every other team has injuries. So keep your mind strong and just make sure you know that every team has holes in it. Your team, your fantasy team, is not the only team with holes. So when you're looking into trades, right, especially trades, Tyler, and you have your star power names, the easiest thing to do is be like, I have to get depth. Let me trade away my stud. And a lot of times you draft these studs for the reason that they can be the anchor for your team. And then when you tear down and you get more questionable pieces, it's how you start to lose your fantasy league. This is one of the worst things you can do. So with your star power, I would say this: be very cautious when you trade your star power away, especially if it's performing star power, early season performers. The reason why you want to be careful is because if you give away producing talent, that takes away your chance at stacking up wins right now before the bye weeks get here. So if you're going to trade a stud, it better be to have like a rock solid lineup, and you better get an overpay on that stud, especially with all the injuries happening right now, Tyler.
Yeah, I think trading away studs is just a bad idea. Like a lot of times in fantasy football is you're carried by studs, and you're able to like right now, like, kind of mentioned Carson Steele, like maybe Carson Steele ends up being the play here and he's the guy in this backfield. And now you have a guy that you can rely on as a solid RB2 if you drafted poorly at the RB2 spot.
It's like Jordan Mason and J.K. Dobbins last week. Same
like
thing.
There's going to be guys, the studs are the irreplaceable people in fantasy football that you just need. You need to rely on week in and week out. Maybe you missed on your studs, maybe not. It's way too early with some of these guys, like I still think it's way too early with like Jamar Chase. CD Lamb had a good week last week, but even like Tyreek Hill, I know people are probably going to panic because
Yeah.
of the Tua situation, but like keep your studs. And I wouldn't be tearing down because that's, like you said, that's honestly how you lose in fantasy football. You
Well, it's
can't
tough.
replace that production.
It's tough because those are the moves. You're like, I want my lineup to look balanced, and I don't want it to
Yeah.
have a waiver wire player in there. But sometimes those guys are startable, right? Like if you
Yeah.
had Alec Pierce in there, Rashid Shaheed, you have your Demarcus Robinsons. There's players in there that maybe they're not great, but like, is that really that much different inconsistency wise than like a Calvin Ridley has been this year, than a George Pickens has been this year? Then some of these guys that you took as your wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, they're inconsistent as well. So that's the difference between a stud and between a waiver player or maybe a flex type player, is the consistency aspect. They can give you those big games more often. So be careful, be very careful with trading away those players, especially if you're not getting back like players that can enter that next tier. Are you panicking if you're 0-2 right now, Tyler? Because that's another thing too. When it comes to injuries, some people are like, man, I have to get a win now. Like, I got to trade away Cooper Kupp. I got to trade away CMC. I got to trade away Pacheco. Like, are you panicking if you're 0-2? What's your strategy when you're 2-0, 1-1, 0-2? Like, what's the panic meter?
No, I mean, like you see it all the time. And I say this, I talk about this kind of stuff all the time too. Like, the NFL landscape drastically changes week to week. Like injuries happen, and you could be looking at your team. Your team looks amazing, and then you drafted, Isaiah Pacheco, and you also had Cooper Kupp, and you're just sitting at your team. I have Cooper Kupp, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like my team's going to be loaded, and now you just suffer through 2 massive injuries, and your team looks completely different. Like things can change so quickly, and also players like if you're 0-2, the problem it probably is right now is just like underperforming players. Like you maybe drafted, I don't know, Jamar Chase in the first round, or like maybe you had CMC.
Yeah,
But like CMC is going to come back at some point this year. Like you just got to kind of grind through it. And like if you're in a league where teams make the playoffs and it's a playoffs, like it just comes down to like making the playoffs.
yeah,
Literally anything can happen in the playoffs. So if you're 0-2 right now, like I wouldn't be panicking. You just got to continue to grind, work the waiver wire, add some of these guys that we're going to talk about, and just keep trying to win. Like that, like there's never a point unless you're like 0-7.
yeah.
Sure, you're probably out, but like it's way too early to be in panic mode right now. There's so much football to still play. The NFL in 2 weeks is probably going to look a lot different than the NFL right now. So no, I wouldn't be panicking. I would just be, grinding a little bit hard. You got to grind no matter what,
Gotta
even if
grind.
you're 2-0. Like doesn't
Gotta
matter. You
grind.
still
Yeah,
got to
because if
you
this
got
was
to
the
turn
week
that roster.
7, if this is the week 7 and week 8 loss back to back, you're not panicking off of that, right? Like
Yeah.
it's fantasy and this is a long season. So